Well, greetings, Byron Rushing, and I'm so happy to be with you here today. I am loving the stained glass in the background of you. This is just a wonderful, beautiful piece of art there. I thought we would start off for our viewers today with sort of some introductory kinds of topics here. So many people really don't have a good understanding of what we mean by reparations. I'm wondering if you could describe what reparations means to you, especially in the context of the work that you have done and the work that you're doing now.
It is, first, let me just say how much I appreciate this invitation to be with you. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. And I also will introduce my background. We have the advantage of having one of our Black parishes here in Boston, St. Cyprian's, made a decision several years ago when they became middle class enough that they could start filling in all their windows with stained glass to make sure that there was a significant number of Black people in that stained glass. And then it really took off, and they decided that that's all they would have in their stained glass. So behind me is Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. And there are a number, probably about 20 other historic figures, both from the Episcopal Church and from other churches, Black churches in these windows. So let me start off with a definition. Definitions are difficult for reparations. I find that one way to answer that question is to speak to two reparations that that many people have actually heard about. Probably the one that is most familiar to people of our generation is the reparations by the nation of Germany after World War II, and the reparations that were given to the survivors of the Jewish Holocaust. And that was a decision after a number of years that the government made, and both the governments of Austria and Germany regularly pay, and still to the present, descendants of that horrible tragedy. And then one that is closer in time is the reparations by the United States government to the Japanese and two generations of their descendants who were imprisoned in concentration camps during World War II. And that is probably the largest amount of money that the United States government has ever given in reparations. And it was a relatively small amount, but we were talking about an event that involved a number of Japanese Americans, but was an event that did not last very, very long. And so it lasted just a few years shy of the length of the whole World War II. So what the definition that I use then is that it is the payment for an incredibly terrible and grievous injustice to not necessarily the people who experience that immediately, but to them and to their descendants. And here we are talking about the horror of slavery, but also the horror of the attitude and treatment of Black people after they were legally free. So in most people who talk about Black reparations are talking about both the period of enslavement and the period after enslavement in legal segregation, but that also includes illegal times of activities such as arresting people so that they would then be able to force them to work on plantations and other places in the South, and of course just the horror of murder and lynchings of people all during that period. I think it's really important to remember when we talk about slavery that we're not talking about some kind of one-time incidental thing that just happened in American history. And I think it's important then to also think about slavery as traumatic, not only to the people who were enslaved, but to their descendants who might have become legally free. And I think about that a lot as just thinking about it in terms of time. And for us in the United States, slavery and the slave trade in the here in what is now the United States has existed longer than emancipation has. So if you use 1619 as the date for the beginning of slavery in the British colonies, and that's a date we might want to come back to, since we have a lot of former Spanish colonies that are now part of the United States, and slavery started there 100 years before. If you use just that date, slavery lasted 246 years. Right? And add 246 years to 1865 and the passage of the 13th Amendment, which was the legal end of slavery in this country, and jot down that date, and it'll be so it will be 2111 that Black people will have been, just using those dates, that Black people will have been free as long as they have been enslaved in this country. That is serious, serious, traumatic living. So it is for all of that we who support reparations are saying there should be some form of restitution. Now, restitution is, of course, because we here are Christians talking to Christians. Restitution is a word that for us we find in confession, right? In penance, because if you are serious about penance and follow the catechism in the prayer book, right? The first thing you do is forgive, right? Right? You ask for forgiveness for what you did, but then you have a plan of restitution, right? For that, and then thirdly, you ask and plan for amendments of life. You will never do it again. You will try never to do it again, right? And so I think we can see this as a form of restitution, but we have to understand that we're talking about this in terms of time and huge groups of people. And we're also talking about it as understanding that it did not have to be. There are people all through slavery and the slave trade that could have said no, and they didn't. And the major group that did not say no and that allowed it to happen, of course, were the colonial governments and then our own United States government. And that is where we get to what should the source for this restitution be. And the source for this restitution should be the government, because they fundamentally decided that it was okay, right? And in the United States, of course, that started long before we were independent. But when we became independent, we made sure it was enshrined in our United States Constitution.
There needs to be more comfort in this country when you talk about reparations. Byron mentioned a few examples. Let me expand on that for just a moment. In 1946, the federal government, with the Indian Claims Commission, gave $1.3 billion to 176 tribes in the United States. In 1971, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act gave $1 billion and returned 44 million acres to the Native American population. In 1862, the Compensation Emancipation Act gave to slaveholders, enslavers, $300 per head for every slave person that they freed. They didn't give any money to the slave person. They went without any cash and they were on their own. And so Byron talked about the other pieces that were there. So we've been doing that. There's also two other very interesting pieces that I would call reparations, but it was cast in such a way as if to help the country develop. One was the Homestead Act of 1862. And what that said was, if you went out west and farmed 160 acres of land, that land was yours. And the federal government made available 246 million acres available for that. And 1.5 million white families were able to take advantage of that. And if you looked at those families today, 46 million of them have legacy wealth that go back to that particular act by the federal government. Now, it also gave land for some Black universities. And that sometimes gets a little lost in it. In 1890, the land grant of the Morrill Act gave land for the historical Black colleges of Central State, of Florida A&M, and 17 other historically Black universities. So there was some attempt by the federal government to help when you look at what was going on during Reconstruction. So the country should be comfortable with that. Oftentimes we forget about that history and forget about it from the standpoint, well, it was history, but that history lives today. And if you looked at the economic issues around African Americans, because of what we've been talking about, you look at wealth. And wealth basically is defined as what you have to be secure, and it's your assets. And if you looked at the comparison between Black assets and white assets, going back to what the Federal Reserve put together in 2016 and again in 2017, that factor is a factor of 10x. The wealth of African Americans, about $16,000. The wealth of whites, $163,000, almost a factor of 10. In 2017, it's the same thing. If you go back 50 years, it's the same relationship. So that pain coming out of Reconstruction and Jim Crow is reflected in the wealth of the African American population when you compare it to the white population. That is severe. And if you also take a hard look at what went on during Roosevelt's time and what Roosevelt did by building these red lines and creating more Black neighborhoods, and people couldn't get out of those Black neighborhoods, couldn't receive loans. If you looked at what was going on during the Social Security period of time, Social Security was granted, to people who were not, if you will, working in homes and working the hard side. It was more of a white middle class beginning for Social Security. Black people were left out of that. So if you look historically, it's just what one would call theft of labor, theft of one's personal security, theft of one's freedom. And so the track record is not a very good track record. You can see it. And as Byron pointed out, it's bad. And, when I go and look into my Bible, I look in Luke 19 I mean, Luke defines what restitution is. And St. Augustine in the City of God points out, without restitution, there's no remission. Deuteronomy 15 talks about giving assistance to those who served you well. You know, and I hearken back to the Good Samaritan piece. You know, that was theft on the road for the Good Samaritan. And when you think about that from the theft of an African-American, you know, our rights and money have been taken away from us. And that's theft.
So I would just add to that we as Christians, when we look at this, we are looking this at and in the terms of reconciliation and justice, which are words that we throw around a little bit more than we do reparations. But I think it's essential that we understand that the solution here has to be one that is as equitable as possible and is in the control of the people that receive the reparations as much as possible. So there's some things that are called reparations that just are not reparations. Any institution that says that their reparations is to set aside money that will be used for good housing for Black people and for scholarships for Black kids and stuff, that is not reparations, because we are having this. In one way, you have to understand this. We are doing this because of decisions that white people made, and those same white people can't then decide how the money is going to be spent. People can argue about the fact that everybody's going to get every Black person who is descended from slavery in what is now the United States will get a check. Exactly right. And they will not get that check with a thing that says you can only spend this on. Right? That, you see, that is just an example of white superiority being used to the very end in the solution. Now, I want to make sure that we not confuse this with institutions of faith that are engaged in paying back the money that they know they directly stole. You see, so when Virginia Theological Seminary does what it is doing, which I think makes a lot of sense, and is they know the names of the Black people who worked or who were, and they didn't own the slaves, Virginia, they rented them from the surrounding plantations, but they know their names because they had to pay their masters. And those enslaved people took care of all those seminarians. They did the laundry, and they took care of the grounds, and sometimes they even were recruited to build buildings at that seminary. We know the names of those people. You know how much they should have been paid if they were white. Pay that money to their ancestors, their descendants. Pay that money to their descendants right now. That's restitution. That's you got caught, and the judge said you got to pay the money you stole. All right, but that's not reparations. Reparations is a larger piece than that. That's an important piece, but it's a larger piece. Right. So what the Jesuits are doing in their tacky way at Georgetown is just not. Of course, they had to lie. They lied that they didn't know where the people went, that the enslaved people they sold, that they owned and sold when they were having problems, economic problems with that university. And of course, we've learned that the descendants of those people never forgot, and they still meet. They know who they are. It's like, right? And so just add up all that money come up with what it would be worth right now and give it to them.
Yeah.
Right? And the Jesuits should be ashamed of themselves. They should just go give them the money. Don't ask the students to pay for something they had no absolutely connection with. Right? Just pay the money.
So let me comment, reparations is more than wealth transfer, as Byron just said, but it's not less than. Let's just be clear.
Yeah.
One of the greatest wealth pieces in the Christian church are our people. It's our human capital that we have. And, we're about trying to equip them to do what we call reparative love. We talk about love thy neighbor. We have a presiding bishop who pushes that model hard on us. And that's where he's coming at this from, and building the beloved community. It's reparative love that needs to be taken care of. Now, the church has some financial resources, there's no question about that. And they need to be allocating those appropriately. But, reparations from a church standpoint has to start in the community. We have been separated, we're segregated. When Plessy versus Ferguson was first put out in 1896, which really segregated the United States by law. And we've been, trying to fix that, but it has hurt us. And so when you look in our communities, we're separate. There's a Black Episcopal Church and there's the white Episcopal Church. You got Black neighborhoods and you got white neighborhoods. So crossing that racial divide has been a real challenge since 1619. And if we're going to do reparative love, and if we're going to talk about building community, because that's where reparations really is going to happen, is in the community.
I think that for us in the Episcopal Church, it begins with our theology. It begins with the Bible, and it begins with our prayer book. Right? But we have to take all of that seriously, that it's meant to be seen as true. Right? And then that means that, as Chuck has just demonstrated, the next step is we have to understand the history of the Episcopal Church and Black people, just like we have to understand the history of the Episcopal Church and Native American people. And that history is, until relatively recently, one that first supported slavery, right, and one that supported racial segregation. They supported racial segregation in the church, and it supported racial segregation in the community. It is difficult to find examples of the Episcopal Church standing up and speaking against racial segregation. The assumption in the Episcopal Church was that decision about racial segregation is a decision that could be made by individuals, right? But not by the church. And so the Episcopal Church never said a thing about racial integration until World War II. You cannot find any official statement of the Episcopal Church condemning racial segregation in the United States until a relatively mild resolution passed General Convention about brotherhood, supporting brotherhood. So we never condemned all of the racial segregation supported by all of the dioceses in the South in the Episcopal Church. As a matter of fact, of course, I hope everybody has realized that that is a Southern myth in the Episcopal Church that we reconciled after the Civil War. That remember the Civil War. During the Civil War, when the Southern diocese separated and formed the Protestant Episcopal Church of the Confederate States of America, right, with its own canons, its own prayer book, right? Remember that was the largest division, schism, that ever existed in the Episcopal Church. And that most likely that schism would have continued if the South had won the war. And we say in positive terms how easy it was for the church to get back together after the Civil War. It was easy because most of the Northerners had supported slavery. Most of the Northern bishops in the Episcopal Church were not abolitionists. And so all of those churches, all of those dioceses were able to come back into the Episcopal Church, right, without any criticism of the position of that schismatic church of the Confederacy during the Civil War. And we were so big on the separation that a few years ago, I was down in Montgomery, Alabama, to see AJI and to see the lynching museum, anti-lynching museum in there, which is profound. But I went to the Episcopal Church, the big Episcopal Church in Montgomery, and on the wall is a plaque commemorating the first meeting to decide on the Confederacy was held at that church building. Right. So I think we need to tell that whole history, and we need to do it. And we don't need to do it for the whole church. We can do it just for our congregations. We should start off with where were our congregations. If they were old, you don't have that many colonial congregations left around. We in New England have tons of them. So when we have 13 churches, surviving congregations in Massachusetts that were started during the colonial period. So they are doing their slavery history now. But then remember those afterwards until the Civil War, those were founded, were supporting slavery, and tell that story. And then there were all the congregations after, right, that period that did not condemn any form of racial segregation in this country. Tell that story. I ask I generally ask white congregations to all make sure that they have in their parish history the first Black person that they ever hired. Right, 2 Black people that I want to have in that and that the first Black person that was ever a member, and who was the first Black person they ever hired. And most of them who ever hired a Black person, the first Black person they hired was a sexton.
Yeah, thanks, Byron. I wanted to also name an important role that you play for the Episcopal Church in the House of Deputies as vice president, and maybe transition from what you were just talking about, what your perspective is on how we're doing at a general convention level in addressing, naming, describing our complicit nature to the things that you're describing, to white supremacy, to supporting all these terrible systems that many of us really struggle with today. How are we doing at a general convention level in your mind?
I think, I think we're doing remarkably well, as long as you don't talk about pace. And so this could have been a lot faster. But one of the things, of course, that has happened over the years is that we have been able to get dioceses to elect more African Americans, and that makes a huge difference, of course, in all of the discussions. That the discussions are not about us, but they are with us, and that has had a major effect on going forward around the issues of race in the Episcopal Church. And so in in the 1950s and 60s, there was very little support for the civil rights movement, because that meant that we would not only be talking about governmental segregation, but we would have to take on the segregation that existed inside the Episcopal Church, and probably that occurred in many of the institutions. Most of the educational institutions. We, of course, are a church that really values education and has a number of schools for children, private schools, essentially private or parochial schools that we run, and almost every one of them coming up to as far north as Pennsylvania were segregated in the Episcopal Church. We had an organization that tried to bring us into the civil rights movement. It was called the Episcopal Society for Cultural and Racial Unity. And they would go and picket all of these schools. They would get into huge arguments with the bishops. And that was the beginning, I think, of the real shift in the Episcopal Church. And fortunately, more and more African Americans were elected to diocesan conventions, some vestries, and then to General Convention. And then by the early 90s, the convention then began to speak in terms of racism and of ending racism, and becoming a church that was not racist, and then beginning at home, and then taking on a political stance to support ending racism in our communities in the country. And I don't think there's it got the bishops to at some point decide that they could vote for an African American to be their presiding bishop. And that of course is where we are today. Correct. And I think again it goes to us focusing on our own history, so that we can then have arguments in the community about how it should be done. And so we, and of course we had to overcome or work to overcome just the incredible heretical position that our Southern diocese had taken all through literally until the 1950s. And of course, they had that major institution that was informing, as Chuck says, the whole Episcopal Church, and that was the University of the South. The University of the South, of course, is an Episcopal Church institution. We all call it SWANY. But it is an Episcopal Church institution. Its trustees are all the bishops, by their office, all the bishops of the Southern diocese, and they insisted on telling that defined history of the South in all of their teaching at that university, and has only in the past 10 years asked for forgiveness of what was a significant influence in the Episcopal Church to support racial segregation.
Pivoting just a little bit, as a longtime Episcopalian that you are, and we're going to skip the mathematics of that, but just trust it. There's one thing I know that you're as familiar with as the rest of us, and it's that sentiment of congregations or parishes you may have experienced at St. John, St. James, is of I don't want to hear politics from the pulpit kind of thing. And some people argue that that's that limits our dialogue, that limits our conversation. Many talk about how that, Jesus was the most political person ever. But maybe it would be interesting if you could talk a little bit about why Episcopalians should have something to say about this, especially in a political context.
I think it's it's very important that we understand that if we believe that God is calling us to form a society that is more just, right? That justice does not happen just automatically because we like justice. It happens because we are involved in those places where we see injustice, and that we are involved in a missionary work to end that injustice. And that means that we are going to go out and have those conversations, not only with our co-parishioners, but with our neighbors outside of our congregations. And having that kind of conversation, as a matter of fact, that kind of conversation is what politics is. See, there is a whole larger politics in our communities than only voting. You see, that only having representation in a city council or a school committee, a state legislature, or finally Congress. There is the politics of the interaction of people about how they believe their communities can best function. And that is the politics that all Episcopalians need to engage in. And if you feel that you are going to have an argument in your congregation because of that, then you work on how you talk about it in your congregation. You don't work to not have the conversation. I was been for a committee I'm working on who is talking about reconciliation. We were looking for how many times does the word reconciliation appear in the prayer book, and it appears a lot. And then we started looking at those particular places, and I found a collect that I have to say, if I ever heard it, I certainly didn't remember it. And it's a collect for the day of St. James, right? And in that collect, it says that we are praying to be a church that continually prays and continually works for reconciliation of all who are at variance and enmity. Wow. I think we need to move that prayer to that be just said once a year. And, because what a wonderful, definition of what we are working for. We're working for a community, a state, a nation, a world where we are there prayerfully saying we will not be in variance and enmity.
Or Byron, let me put that another way. You made an interesting comment on that webinar with Sandy and Nathan Baxter, and you made the comment that whenever you walk in a room, you kind of know how many Black people are in it. Mm-hmm. You make it a point to kind of know, but it's just natural to count. And I would say not only do you walk in and but you also want to find out who they are. And you make certain that you understand that you may even go into, well, who's your family? Where'd you go to school? And so there's that the reconciliation among Black folks to find out who you are and to get to better know you. It would be nice that the white population would walk into a room and count how many white people are there and do the same kind of understanding of who's there that Black people do just automatically today. So that's kind of how I read that collect that you just said, because I heard you say that and I really related to that.
Right. And I think, and thank you for reminding me about that, Chuck, because I do think I think it's a spiritual practice that white people should adopt. And that is count the white people in the room, count the non-white people in the room, no matter what the meeting is, whether, and to get a sense of what this community that they are in is, but also to understand that you cannot pretend that there is no such thing as race, right? I think that all the white people in your diocese know that that if they're ever going to say, I don't see color, that make sure they never say that to a Black person.
Well, friends, we have a few more minutes in our time together. Just curious if you have sort of a final word, either Steve or Chuck, in terms of a reflection on what we've heard or a question. And then Byron, of course, if you have a good closing word for the people of Bethlehem, I'm sure we'd love to hear it.
Well, my closing word to the people of Bethlehem is keep doing what you're doing. Just do it faster. And I think that recognizing that reparations is an important piece of what we're doing. It is not the only thing that we need to do, but it is an important piece of restitution and reconciliation that we need to do, and learn as much about that as possible. We have a tendency to think that that anytime someone comes up with a good idea, we should try to get it done in 2 years, right? Understand that we are not going to end this. We are not going to get to a place of racial reconciliation in this country without a lot more work. And it's going to take a long time, and don't expect it to happen even in your lifetime. And the other piece is really, you've heard a little bit of history in these past few minutes. Really search for that history as close to where you are. Look for that history in your immediate secular world. What was the history of your place and race? But more importantly, learn and publish that history in your Episcopal Church congregation or other institution that you're involved in. I want to go on your website. I'm going to check you out in a year of some of your parishes and see if you have more on your website and your parish history than the architect of your building, right? And the list of your ordained. Thank you.